This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a particular kind of disappearance no one talks about because it does not look like tragedy from the outside. It does not come with sirens. It does not leave shattered glass on the floor. It does not announce itself in a way that makes other people stop and say, something is wrong with her. It is quieter than that. More polished. More socially acceptable. It happens while I am still showing up to work, still answering texts, still remembering birthdays, still buying groceries, still making eye contact, still saying I'm good when someone asks how I am. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because a woman can vanish from herself while still appearing completely functional. I know what that kind of vanishing feels like. It feels like being called strong so many times that no one notices I am tired. It feels like being appreciated for how much I can carry, but not truly seen for how much it costs me to carry it. It feels like being the woman everyone relies on and somehow still going to bed with the private, unnamed ache of not feeling deeply held by anyone. It feels like sitting in a parked car for 5 extra minutes in total silence before walking into the house, because that silence is the only place in the day where I can hear something honest moving inside me. It feels like smiling through dinner, cleaning the kitchen, answering one more message, folding one more load of laundry, checking one more thing off the list, then catching my own reflection in a dark window and feeling a shock of distance, as if I have become very efficient at living a life I no longer fully inhabit. That is the woman I want to talk to. Not the woman whose life is visibly falling apart. The woman whose life still works. The woman who still works. The woman who is admired for being capable, composed, thoughtful, mature, emotionally intelligent, dependable. The woman who has learned how to survive disappointment without making it ugly for everyone else. The woman who has become so skilled at managing the emotional temperature in every room that she has almost forgotten what her own inner climate feels like. That woman is not broken. But she is in danger of becoming invisible to herself. And the most unsettling part is this: sometimes nobody did this to me in one brutal moment. Sometimes it happened slowly, respectfully, almost elegantly. Through years of being the reasonable one. The flexible one. The understanding one. The one who does not ask for too much. The one who can let it go. The one who does not want drama. The one who can handle it. Until one day I realize that handling it has become the entire architecture of my identity. And now I no longer know where the performance ends and I begin. If that sentence lands somewhere deep in you, stay with me. And before I go any further, subscribe to the channel if this already feels like a conversation you have been needing in private. That support matters, and it helps me keep making these videos for women who are not looking for noise or empty motivation, but for something honest enough to reach them where they really live. There is a loneliness that comes with being the woman who looks fine. It is not the loud loneliness people recognize. It is not abandonment in the obvious sense. It is a quieter loneliness. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who know how useful I am, how competent I am, how calm I am, how giving I am, without really knowing what it costs me to remain that woman. Because usefulness can become a mask. And if I wear it long enough, even I can forget that it is there. I think that is one of the cruelest things about this kind of life. I may not even realize I have been slowly disappearing, because everyone around me keeps rewarding the very qualities that are erasing me. They praise my patience, my grace, my strength, my loyalty, my maturity, my ability to keep going. And none of those things are bad. But when those qualities are fed at the expense of my truth, they stop being virtues and start becoming survival strategies. That is when resentment begins to grow in places I cannot admit out loud. Not because I am unloving. Because I am exhausted. Exhausted from being emotionally available before I have even checked whether I have anything left to give. Exhausted from saying yes with my mouth while my body quietly says no. Exhausted from being mistaken for stable when what I really am is practiced. Exhausted from always having the right tone, the softened answer, the mature response, the clean explanation, the polished version of what I really feel. There are women listening to this who have not cried in weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. Not because they are at peace. Because they are beyond the point of immediate reaction. They have become so disciplined in carrying themselves that their emotions no longer arrive dramatically. They arrive as numbness, as fatigue, as irritation with no obvious source, as a low hum of dread when the phone lights up with a certain name, as the desire to cancel plans they agreed to out of politeness, as the feeling of wanting everyone to leave, not because they hate anyone, but because they have not been alone with themselves in any meaningful way for too long. And still, if someone asked them how they were doing, they would probably say, "I'm fine." That word has hidden entire lives. I'm fine. Fine can mean I am keeping up appearances. Fine can mean I am no longer sure what I want. Fine can mean I am respected in public and dismissed in private. Fine can mean my marriage is quiet, my friendships are functional, my career is steady, my bills are paid, my house is clean, and something inside me is starving. Fine can mean I do not have permission to fall apart, so I have learned how to disappear in smaller ways instead. I think many women have been taught to fear obvious collapse while never being warned about subtle self-erasure. No one tells me that I can lose myself while being admired. No one tells me that I can become deeply lonely inside a life that looks beautiful from across the street. No one tells me that competence can become a cage. No one tells me that being the strong one can turn into a quiet form of emotional exile. And because this kind of pain is not dramatic, it often goes unaddressed for years. A woman can live inside this pattern through her 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. She can keep doing what needs to be done. She can keep mothering, working, caregiving, partnering, organizing, showing up, being chosen for her reliability and overlooked in her complexity. She can become loved for what she provides, needed for what she manages, praised for what she endures, and still remain unknown in the places where she longs most to be met. That is not a small wound. That is a life-altering one. Because once I begin to feel that distance from myself, everything changes color. My relationships begin to feel heavier. My home begins to feel less like refuge and more like another place where things are expected of me. Even my own body can begin to feel like a place I visit only when it is in pain. And then, if I am not careful, I start mistaking self-abandonment for adulthood. I call it responsibility. I call it love. I call it being realistic. I call it what women do. But underneath all of that naming, there is often a simpler truth waiting in the dark. I have been living as though everyone else's comfort matters more than my own aliveness. That truth is hard to face. It is also the beginning of everything. Because the moment I can name my disappearance, I am no longer fully trapped inside it. The moment I can admit that I have become too available, too agreeable, too easy to depend on, too far removed from my own hunger, my own anger, my own preferences, my own limits, something begins to return. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to make me pause before the automatic yes. Enough to make me notice the relationships where I feel smaller instead of safer. Enough to make me question why I am always the one adjusting. Enough to make me wonder what respect would feel like if it were not just something I wanted from other people, but something I began practicing toward myself. That is where this conversation begins. Not with a woman who is shattered. With a woman who is polished, capable, functional, quietly lost. And maybe that is why this matters so much. Because women like this are everywhere. At office meetings. At school pickup. At dinner parties. At the grocery store. in long marriages, after divorce, inside good neighborhoods and beautiful homes and carefully built lives. Women who are doing fine. Women who are disappearing. Women who are waiting, maybe without even knowing it, for one honest sentence to find them. Maybe this is that sentence. I do not want to keep being well managed at the cost of being fully alive. And if that stirs something in you, then stay with me. Because this is where the story starts. Why so many women were taught to earn love by overgiving. What I have come to understand, and what took me far too long to name without shame, is that many women were never taught to receive love. We were taught to secure it, to maintain it, to protect it from leaving, to anticipate its moods, soften its edges, and keep it from turning cold. Somewhere early, often before I had language for any of it, love stopped feeling like something I could simply inhabit and began to feel like something I had to manage. That management can begin in a home that looks perfectly decent from the outside. No broken plates. No police calls. No dramatic scenes that would make a teacher pull me aside and ask if everything was okay. Sometimes it begins in quieter places. In the look that crosses a mother's face when I express too much feeling. In the way a father becomes easier to reach when I am high-performing, agreeable, or impressive. In the invisible reward system of family life, where being helpful earns warmth, being easy earns approval, and having needs of my own creates tension no one wants to name. Girls are observant long before people give us credit for it. I did not need anyone to sit me down and explain the rules directly. I could feel them. I could feel what made a room go still. I could feel which version of me was welcomed and which version asked too much. I could feel when truth needed to be trimmed down into something more convenient for everyone around me. So I learned. I learned that being mature would get me further than being messy. I learned that being useful would get me loved faster than being vulnerable. I learned that reading the emotional weather in the room was safer than speaking from my own storm. I learned that if I could become easy enough to keep, maybe I would not be left with the full weight of my feelings by myself. This is how overgiving begins for many women. Not as generosity in its healthiest form, but as adaptation. As emotional intelligence shaped too early by the need for safety. As a way of becoming someone whose value is never in question because she is always bringing something to the table. Calm. Help. Loyalty. Emotional labor. Practical support. Forgiveness. Understanding. Solutions. Gentleness. Flexibility. A pleasant tone. A beautiful silence. And the tragedy is that these qualities often make a woman deeply lovable in the eyes of the world while making her more likely to be used by people who know how to take without reciprocating. I think about my mother, Evelyn, sometimes when I try to trace the roots of this. Not in a flat, angry way. Not as an excuse to stop taking responsibility for who I became. But as an act of honesty. She had her own wounds, her own disappointments, her own private hungers that never found a clean place to live. I can see that now with adult eyes. But a daughter does not grow up inside a mother's pain as theory. She grows up inside its atmosphere. My mother could be attentive in practical ways, but emotionally there was often a current underneath her love that felt conditional. She liked competence. She respected composure. She admired women who could endure quietly. What she did not know how to make room for, at least not with consistency, was a daughter who might be uncertain, emotional, angry, contradictory, soft one minute and lost the next. There was something in her that seemed to tighten whenever I became too fully human. So I learned not to become too much at once. I learned to edit myself in real time. I learned to be pleasant when I was hurt. I learned to be helpful when I wanted comfort. I learned to present strength when I needed tenderness. I learned to make myself legible in ways that would not burden anyone else. That kind of training does not stay in childhood. It grows with me. It follows me into friendships, where I become the woman everyone confides in but few really hold. It follows me into love, where I mistake being needed for being cherished. It follows me into work, where competence gets me praised and overloaded in the same breath. It follows me into divorce, into single motherhood, into rooms where I am still unconsciously trying to prove that I am worth staying close to because I am so very easy to depend on. This is why I do not believe people-pleasing begins in vanity or weakness. It begins in interpretation, in the careful reading of what earns connection and what threatens it. If a girl grows up in an environment where rest looks lazy, emotion looks inconvenient, anger looks dangerous, and independence is praised only when it does not disrupt anyone else, then she may become a woman who no longer knows how to separate love from performance. She may call it being thoughtful. She may call it being low maintenance. She may call it being a good partner, a good daughter, a good friend, a good woman. But beneath those noble names, there can be a private terror. If I stop giving in this way, will I still matter here? That question can shape an entire life. I think many women were also taught to earn love through overgiving by the culture around them, not just the homes they came from. There are whole systems that reward female self-erasure while pretending to admire female strength. Women are praised for holding everything together. We are praised for being the one who remembers, who anticipates, who nurtures, who smooths over, who keeps family ties alive, who notices what nobody else notices and fixes what nobody else had to think about. And because this labor is often framed as natural, even noble, women can spend years performing it without asking the most dangerous question of all. Who am I when I am not being useful? That question can feel almost destabilizing when a woman has built her identity around being needed. Because usefulness is concrete. It gets responses. Gratitude, sometimes. Dependence, often. But being loved for usefulness is not the same as being loved for presence. One asks what I can do. The other asks who I am. Many women never get invited into that second question early enough. Instead, we learn a more punishing version of intimacy. We learn to anticipate before we are asked. To overfunction before something falls apart. To sense disappointment before it is spoken. To become students of everyone else's comfort. By the time we are grown, this can look almost beautiful from the outside. She is so thoughtful. She is so giving. She is the one who always shows up. But there is often pain under that praise. Because overgiving is not always abundance. Sometimes it is fear in a graceful outfit. Fear that if I stop being excellent at care, I will be less wanted. Fear that if I become inconvenient, I will lose access to love. Fear that if I say what I really feel, I will no longer be considered good. And that fear can become especially powerful in relationships with men. I think many women were taught, explicitly or subtly, that femininity is measured by what I can absorb. How patient I am with male immaturity. How forgiving I am with inconsistency. How nurturing I can be without asking for too much in return. How much confusion I can relabel as complexity. How much loneliness I can call loyalty. That training is brutal because it teaches a woman to override her own body in the name of love. The body says, this feels unsafe, this feels one-sided, this feels draining, this feels wrong. But the conditioning says, be understanding, be patient, be soft, be less reactive, be more mature, give it time. Time has hidden so much damage in women's lives. Not because time heals everything. Because time can also normalize what should have been questioned much sooner. By the time I was older, by the time there was Daniel and then no Daniel, by the time I was raising Claire and trying to understand what I wanted my life to feel like in Seattle beyond responsibility, I could see how much of my identity had been shaped by old bargains I did not know I was still honoring. Be steady and people will rely on you. Be easy and people will stay. Be perceptive and you can prevent pain before it starts. Be generous and maybe no one will accuse you of being difficult. But those bargains always cost something. They cost spontaneity. They cost anger. They cost rest. They cost mystery. They cost desire. They cost the right to change without apology. They cost the right to say, this no longer works for me, even if it used to. And eventually they cost self-trust, because if I am always scanning outward for proof that I am still lovable, I stop building the inward authority that lets me know I am still mine. That may be the deepest injury of all. Not simply that women were taught to earn love by overgiving, but that in the process, many of us were never taught how to belong to ourselves. We learned how to belong in families, relationships, workplaces, churches, neighborhoods, social circles. We learned the choreography of making ourselves acceptable. But we were not always taught how to remain intact while doing it. So we enter adulthood carrying a dangerous misunderstanding that love is something I secure through effort, not something that should be able to breathe in the presence of my full humanity. And if that misunderstanding is never examined, it can become destiny. I can keep choosing people who are most comfortable with the version of me that asks for little. I can keep offering emotional labor where reciprocity is weak. I can keep calling depletion devotion. I can keep mistaking the familiar ache of overgiving for evidence that I care deeply. But there comes a moment when a woman begins to see the pattern without romanticizing it. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Sometimes just in fragments. In the silence after a phone call with Evelyn. In the heaviness after one more one-sided conversation with Marissa. In the strange relief that comes when I do not immediately respond. In the realization that my whole life cannot keep being a series of emotional offerings placed at the feet of other people's comfort. That is where something shifts. Not into blame. Into truth. The truth that many women were taught to earn love by becoming useful, beautiful in manageable ways, emotionally accommodating, spiritually forgiving, endlessly adaptive. And the truth that this training may explain me, but it does not have to define me forever. Because understanding where the pattern came from is not an excuse to stay trapped in it. It is the first honest light I turn on in a room I have been living in for years. The hidden ways disrespect enters a woman's life. One of the hardest things I have had to admit is that disrespect does not always enter a woman's life in a form dramatic enough to alarm her. It rarely arrives with a warning label. It does not always shout. It does not always humiliate in public. It does not always look cruel in the clean, undeniable way that would let me point to it immediately and say, there, that is the moment everything changed. More often, it enters quietly. It enters through repetition. Through assumption. Through familiarity. Through the small, almost forgettable moments that teach me, over time, that my comfort is negotiable, my time is flexible, my body is available, my energy is renewable, and my silence can be counted on. That is what makes it so dangerous. Disrespect often begins before I have language for it. Sometimes before I even realize I am allowed to object. I think many women imagine disrespect as something obvious. A raised voice. A cutting insult. A betrayal too large to explain away. But the hidden forms are often more corrosive because they do not force an immediate reckoning. They slip into daily life and get absorbed into the atmosphere. They become part of the furniture. I adjust to them. I walk around them. I call them personality differences, stress, misunderstanding, complicated history, bad timing, a rough season, the way he is, the way she has always been. And all the while, something inside me keeps records. A husband who responds to my emotional truth with logistics. A friend who only reaches for me when her life is on fire. A mother who speaks to me as if my boundaries are personal injuries. An ex-husband like Daniel who can still, in one text, make me feel the old pressure to stay calm, stay reasonable, stay easy. A woman like Marissa, who knows exactly how to sound fragile enough to reopen the door every time I begin to close it. Disrespect is not always a direct attack. Sometimes it is the steady expectation that I will absorb what others do not want to deal with in themselves. That expectation can look almost flattering at first. People trust me. People rely on me. People come to me. People say I am strong, grounded, wise, compassionate, emotionally mature. But if I am not careful, all of those compliments can become a kind of trap. Because there is a difference between being valued and being used well. There is a difference between being appreciated and being treated as if I exist to make everything run more smoothly for everyone else. I have learned that one of the first hidden signs of disrespect is being treated like a function instead of a person. Not asked how I am, but asked what I can do. Not met with care, but met with expectation. Not invited into mutuality, but assigned a role. When that happens long enough, a woman can begin to confuse usefulness with intimacy. She can start believing that if she is central enough to everyone else's emotional life, then she must be loved deeply. But usefulness is not the same thing as reverence. And being needed is not the same thing as being known. The hidden ways disrespect enters a woman's life are often subtle enough that she begins by doubting herself rather than questioning the pattern. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe she did not mean it that way. Maybe I am just tired. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe this is what long relationships look like. Maybe all families are like this. Maybe I expect too much. That kind of self-interrogation is exhausting. It also protects unhealthy dynamics. Because as long as I keep putting myself on trial, I never fully investigate what the other person has grown comfortable taking from me. A woman can lose years inside that confusion. I think about the hidden forms of disrespect that do not get named often enough. Being interrupted so routinely that I stop finishing my thought. Being expected to answer quickly because people are accustomed to my availability. Being handed emotional weight with no regard for whether I have room to carry it. Being teased in ways that are socially acceptable but privately diminishing. Being spoken to in a tone that assumes I will accommodate. Being left to manage the mood after someone else creates tension. Being praised for my patience while nobody questions why so much patience is required of me in the first place. These things matter because they shape the nervous system. They teach the body whether it is safe to remain fully present or whether it needs to split itself in order to maintain the relationship. A lot of women do not realize they are experiencing disrespect because what they feel first is not outrage. It is fatigue. A certain heaviness after contact. A need to lie down after a family gathering. Irritation that appears too quickly and seems out of proportion until I remember how many small things piled up to create it. A tightening in the chest when a certain name lights up on the phone. A low hum of dread before seeing someone I should want to see. The body often understands what the mind is still trying to excuse. That is one reason subtle disrespect can be so destabilizing. It creates a split. My body says, something is wrong here. My training says, be gracious, do not make this bigger than it needs to be, keep perspective, do not embarrass anyone, do not be difficult. So I stay outwardly composed while inwardly fraying. I smile at the table while feeling myself disappear. I answer the call while resentment forms in my throat. I continue the friendship while my spirit quietly starts withdrawing from it. This happens in marriage more than many women admit. Not always in the spectacularly broken marriages. Sometimes in the respectable ones. The ones that look stable from the outside. The ones where the bills are paid, the routines function, the photos still look decent, and the emotional life has slowly become unequal in ways no one names. A woman can become the manager of the home, the keeper of emotional continuity, the soft place everyone lands, while her own interior world goes largely unvisited. She may not be openly mistreated, which makes it harder to name what hurts. But neglect has a way of becoming its own form of disrespect when one person's emotional labor is treated like background noise rather than sacred effort. It happens in friendship too, especially among women who are old enough to have history and young enough to still be trying to make sense of it. History can hide imbalance. Years can make access feel deserved. A friend like Marissa can seem woven into the fabric of my life simply because she has been there a long time. But time does not purify a dynamic. It only deepens its pattern. A friendship can be old and still be extractive. It can be affectionate and still be competitive. It can sound intimate and still lack real reciprocity. I think one of the more painful truths is that disrespect often enters through the places where I most want to believe in love. Family, friendship, marriage, motherhood, work I care about, communities where I have invested. That is why women ignore it for as long as they do. Not because we are foolish, but because naming disrespect in meaningful relationships forces a harder question. If this is true, what will I have to change? And change has a cost. If I admit that my mother, Evelyn, regularly speaks to me in ways that leave me feeling small, I may have to stop pretending that love alone can make that harmless. If I admit that Daniel still knows how to use the old shape of my politeness against me, I may have to become less emotionally accessible than I once was. If I admit that Marissa feels most attached to me when I am most available to her needs, I may have to step back and lose not only the friendship, but the identity I built inside it. That is why many women live with low-grade disrespect for years. Because the truth is not only painful, it is expensive. Still, there is another cost to not naming it. And that cost is the slow erosion of self-trust. Every time I feel a moment land badly and then talk myself out of it, I teach myself that my perception is less reliable than someone else's comfort. Every time I excuse a pattern my body has already recognized, I weaken my own loyalty to what I know. Over time, that becomes devastating. Because if I cannot trust the part of me that feels the violation, how will I ever protect the life that depends on that wisdom? This is why the hidden ways disrespect enters a woman's life matter so much. They are not small just because they are subtle. They are formative. They teach me what I am expected to tolerate. They teach others how far they can go without consequence. They teach the room whether I will prioritize honesty or harmony. And eventually, they teach me whether I belong to myself or to the role everyone else has assigned me. I do not think healing begins the first time I set a boundary. I think it begins even earlier, in the moment I stop dismissing what I feel. In the moment I tell the truth to myself before I try to explain it away. In the moment I admit that being chronically interrupted, emotionally overused, quietly minimized, or endlessly leaned on is not a personality mismatch. It is a sign. A sign that I have been asked to remain generous in places where generosity is no longer safe. A sign that I have been treating discomfort like confusion when it was actually information. A sign that part of becoming a more honest woman will require me to stop calling subtle disrespect by softer names. Why people-pleasing feels safer than telling the truth. What I had to learn, slowly and without romanticizing it, is that people-pleasing does not feel safe because it is healthy. It feels safe because it is familiar. It feels safe because the body often chooses what it already knows how to survive over what might actually set it free. That distinction changed the way I understood myself. For a long time, I thought my difficulty with telling the truth cleanly meant I was too soft, too indecisive, too worried about what people thought. That was the shallow version of the story. The deeper version was harder to face. I was not simply avoiding discomfort. I was trying to avoid the emotional consequences my body had learned to expect from honesty. For some women, the truth is not just a sentence. It is a risk. Not always because the current moment is dangerous, but because somewhere earlier in life, truth became associated with rupture, with withdrawal, with tension in the room, with punishment, with coldness, with being seen as selfish, difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful. So even when I became an adult living in Seattle, even when I had my own home and my own schedule and the visible architecture of an independent life, there were still moments when a simple honest response could make me feel like I was standing on the edge of something much larger than the conversation itself. That is the strange thing about people-pleasing. From the outside, it can look like politeness, grace, good manners, emotional intelligence. But on the inside, it can feel much more primal. A small spike in the chest, a tightening in the throat, a sudden need to soften the sentence before it leaves my mouth, a mental scramble for the most harmless possible wording, a private urgency to make sure the other person feels okay before I have even asked whether I am okay. That is not just niceness. That is conditioning moving through the body in real time. I have felt it with my mother, Evelyn, in the tiny pause before telling her I did not want to discuss something. I have felt it with Marissa, when I knew she was asking for more than I wanted to give but still found myself considering how to decline in a way that would not trigger her disappointment. I have felt it with Daniel, especially after the divorce, when he would send a message that looked practical on the surface but carried that old undertow of emotional familiarity, and I could feel how easy it would be to slide back into the role of being calm, accommodating, and available just enough to keep things easy. That word matters. Easy. People-pleasing often begins as the desire to make the moment easier. Easier for them to hear. Easier for them to accept. Easier for them to remain close. Easier for them not to be upset. But what I started noticing is that every time I made the moment easier for someone else by making myself less honest, I paid for it later. Not always dramatically. Sometimes the cost was subtle. A heaviness after the conversation. A low-grade resentment. A restlessness at night. A kind of inward slump, as if some part of me had watched me abandon it again and did not fully trust me to come back. That is one of the deepest injuries of people-pleasing. It does not only shape my relationships with other people. It quietly damages my relationship with myself. Because each time I tell a softer version of the truth than the one I actually know, I teach myself that my real feeling is too disruptive to carry cleanly. Each time I over-explain my no, I imply that my no cannot stand on its own. Each time I say yes to keep the emotional air smooth, I reinforce the idea that someone else's temporary comfort matters more than my inner coherence. And over time, that creates a painful split. Outwardly, I look composed. Internally, I feel less and less solid. The reason people-pleasing can become so automatic is that it often works in the short term. It does reduce friction. It does prevent certain conflicts. It does create the appearance of harmony. It does allow me to avoid the immediate discomfort of being misunderstood, resented, questioned, or emotionally chased. But temporary relief is not the same as safety. That may be one of the most important truths in this entire conversation. Relief is the exhale after I avoid upsetting someone. Safety is the deeper knowing that I can tell the truth and still remain on my own side. Those are not the same thing. Many women have spent years settling for relief because real safety was never properly modeled. If what I saw growing up was emotional unpredictability, criticism, guilt, withdrawal, or subtle punishment whenever honesty disrupted the existing order, then of course people-pleasing would feel more natural than directness. Of course I would become skilled at tone management. Of course I would learn to read faces, anticipate reactions, edit myself, delay my real response, and package my boundaries in enough softness that no one could accuse me of having changed. That is not stupidity. That is adaptation. But adaptation has a shelf life. Eventually, the pattern that once helped me preserve connection begins to cost more than the connection itself. That is when people-pleasing stops feeling like kindness and starts feeling like self-erasure. I think one of the hardest places this shows up is in ordinary communication. Not the big moments. The small, daily ones. A text I do not want to answer right away. A dinner invitation I do not want to accept. A phone call from Evelyn when I already know the conversation will leave me emotionally bruised. A message from Marissa that begins with "I know you're busy, but," and already assumes I will make room. A co-parenting exchange with Daniel that should take 2 sentences and somehow invites emotional leakage from a marriage that no longer exists. These moments are not dramatic enough to justify a dramatic response. That is why so many women keep slipping into people-pleasing inside them. I tell myself it is easier to just handle it. Easier to say yes. Easier to reply now. Easier to stay pleasant. Easier to keep the peace. Easier not to create unnecessary tension. But unnecessary for whom? That question has become very important to me. Because many of the tensions women avoid are only considered unnecessary because we have been trained to see our own needs as less urgent than everyone else's expectations. My fatigue becomes less important than their preference. My discomfort becomes less important than their reaction. My boundary becomes less important than the possibility that someone might decide I am no longer as warm, as flexible, as easy to love. This is why telling the truth can feel almost disproportionately hard. I am not only confronting the present moment. I am brushing against years of old emotional math. If I disappoint someone, will I be punished? If I say no, will I be left out? If I become less available, will I become less wanted? If I stop being the version of myself they are used to, will I still belong here? Belonging is often the hidden thing women are protecting when we people please. Not approval in a shallow sense. Belonging. The desire to remain inside the circle. The family system. The friendship. The marriage. The emotional arrangement. The familiar role. Even when that role is too small for who I have become, there is still something frightening about stepping outside it. At least inside the old role, I know who I am expected to be. Outside it, I may have to discover who I am without constant negotiation. And that can feel startlingly lonely at first. I think that is why people-pleasing and truth-telling feel so different in the body. People-pleasing often feels tense, but recognizable. Truth-telling can feel naked. When I say, "I'm not available tonight," without a long explanation, I feel exposed. When I say, "I don't want to talk about that," to Evelyn, I feel exposed. When I tell Marissa, "I can't be that person for you right now," I feel exposed. When I tell Daniel, "Please keep this about Claire," I feel exposed. Exposure is not danger, but the nervous system does not always know the difference right away. That is why some women cry after setting a simple boundary. That is why guilt can arrive after a clean no. That is why I may replay the conversation afterward, not because I was unclear, but because an older part of me still believes honesty should come with punishment. I wish more women were allowed to talk about that without being rushed into empowerment language. Sometimes the truth does not feel powerful at first. Sometimes it feels shaky. Sometimes it feels like grief. Sometimes it feels like walking out of an old emotional costume and realizing how much of my identity had been stitched into keeping everybody comfortable. And yet, for all its discomfort, truth does something people-pleasing never can. It brings me back into integrity. It may not bring immediate peace in the room. It may not make me look especially graceful. It may not preserve every relationship. But it does something quieter and more essential. It ends the war between what I feel and what I say. That is no small thing. A woman can live for years carrying that internal split, smiling where she aches, agreeing where she resists, giving where she resents, staying where she has already left emotionally. The outside world may call her mature. The body often calls it exhaustion. So I have had to learn that truth is not a performance of confidence. It is a practice of reunion. A way of returning to myself each time I refuse to lie in the direction of comfort. Not all truths need to be dramatic. Some of the most important ones are almost plain. No, I can't. I'm not doing that. That doesn't work for me. I need space. I've already answered. I'm leaving now. I'm not available for this conversation. Simple sentences. But for a woman trained to manage the emotions of everyone around her, these sentences can feel like a revolution in the mouth. What has changed for me is not that telling the truth suddenly feels easy. It is that I no longer confuse difficulty with wrongness. The discomfort that comes when I stop people-pleasing is not always a sign that I am being unkind. Often it is a sign that I am interrupting an old reflex. A reflex that once protected me. A reflex that now costs too much. And so I have had to become willing to disappoint people in small ways so I can stop abandoning myself in larger ones. That is what truth asks of me. Not perfection. Not fearlessness. Just a deeper loyalty to what I know, even when pleasing someone else would feel easier in the moment. The relationships that feed on my silence. One of the most painful things I have had to accept is that not every relationship suffers because of misunderstanding. Some relationships suffer because silence was the glue holding them together. That truth is difficult because it asks more of me than simply becoming a better communicator. It asks me to look at what the relationship was actually built on. Not what I hoped it was. Not what it occasionally felt like in its softer moments. Not what history, loyalty, or shared seasons made me want to believe. It asks me to look at the structure underneath the sentiment. And sometimes the structure is this: I was carrying more than my share, saying less than I felt, and calling the imbalance love. There are relationships that can survive truth. They may stretch a little when honesty enters. They may need adjustment, tenderness, time. But they do not collapse the moment I stop over-accommodating. They do not turn punitive when I become more specific. They do not become colder when I stop performing emotional availability on command. Then there are relationships that depend on my silence. Relationships that become tense when I am no longer easy. Relationships that lose their warmth when I stop absorbing what belongs to the other person. Relationships that require me to remain unclear in order for the connection to feel smooth. Relationships in which my self-betrayal has been mistaken for closeness for so long that when I stop offering it, the whole dynamic begins to wobble. That wobble is revealing. It does not always mean the other person is evil. It does mean the relationship may have been organized around access to me, not mutual reverence for me. I have had to face that with Daniel in ways I did not understand while I was still married. A marriage can look functional from the outside while quietly becoming dependent on one person's emotional silence. What I mean by that is not simply that I did not speak. I did speak. I mentioned things. I raised concerns. I tried to articulate what was missing. But there is a difference between speaking and telling the full truth at full volume inside your own life. I often softened what I knew in order to preserve the emotional stability of the relationship. I translated my pain into something easier to receive. I approached what hurt through the doorway of reason because it felt safer than arriving with the full, unedited force of what I actually felt. That kind of marriage can continue for years. Not because it is deeply intimate. Because one person is doing a tremendous amount of emotional buffering, smoothing, explaining, absorbing, reframing, waiting, forgiving, staying reasonable. When that person stops, the marriage does not always break because she became difficult. Sometimes it breaks because her silence was one of the hidden beams holding up the house. That truth followed me even after the divorce. Daniel still knew how to lean on the old version of me. The version that would keep things pleasant, keep things calm, keep things from becoming more complicated than necessary. And for a while, I kept stepping back into that role because it seemed mature. It seemed civilized. It seemed like the right thing to do for Claire. But there is a difference between healthy cooperation and emotional trespassing disguised as familiarity. Some people continue to approach me through the pathways my silence built for them. If I do not close those pathways deliberately, they remain open by default. I have had to face something similar with Marissa, though friendship wounds move differently. A one-sided friendship is often harder to name than a one-sided romance because women are taught to romanticize endurance in friendship. We tell ourselves that history matters, that everyone goes through hard seasons, that friendship is not always equal, that being needed is part of intimacy. And all of that can be true, in part. But there is a point where compassion becomes the language I use to avoid admitting I am being drained. Marissa was not cruel in a dramatic way. In some ways, that made the truth harder to hold. She could be funny, warm, observant, even generous in flashes. But the center of the friendship was tilted. Her crises had gravity. Her moods shaped the emotional weather. Her need reached loudly. My life, by contrast, was something she visited selectively. She wanted my steadiness, my listening, my perspective, my patience. But she did not always want my full truth. Especially not if it disrupted the role she had assigned me. That is what some relationships do. They assign me a function and then call the function by my name. The healer. The strong one. The loyal one. The one who understands. The one who never makes things harder. The one who can take a little more. At first, these roles can feel meaningful. They let me feel central, valuable, needed. But over time they become restrictive. Because a role can only love the parts of me that serve the dynamic. The rest of me becomes inconvenient. My limits become attitude. My absence becomes distance. My clarity becomes coldness. My need becomes an interruption. This is why some relationships react so strongly when a woman changes. It is not only that she changed. It is that her old shape was useful. Her old shape made access easy. Her old shape softened consequences. Her old shape absorbed the emotional overflow. Her old shape created room for everyone else's needs without asking whether she was disappearing in the process. When that shape changes, people notice. Not everyone notices with grace. Some people become subtle critics. They say I am different, but in a tone that suggests deficiency, not growth. Some become suddenly sentimental, reaching for the old closeness the moment they feel the distance I am building. Some become wounded. Some become angry. Some become more manipulative, not less. They may cry. They may guilt me. They may invoke history, loyalty, family, the children, the past, the good years, all the things meant to make me question whether I am being too harsh. This is what makes unhealthy relationships so confusing. They are not always devoid of genuine feeling. They may contain affection, memory, tenderness, chemistry, even real love in places. But the love is often tangled with entitlement. And entitlement always panics when access begins to close. I have seen this most clearly in family. With my mother, Evelyn, the pressure was rarely blatant. It did not need to be. Family can create compliance through old emotional coding alone. One sigh. One change in tone. One phrase that reactivates the daughter in me. She did not have to scream to make me feel the pull to return to an older version of myself. She only had to imply that my boundary was unkind, ungrateful, unnecessary, or too much. That is how some family relationships feed on silence. Not through open domination, but through emotional memory. Through the old choreography of guilt and accommodation. Through the expectation that my love should still look like availability, even when availability is hurting me. The same can happen at work, though the language changes. A capable woman becomes the emotional infrastructure of a room. She remembers details, smooths tension, handles difficult personalities, responds thoughtfully, notices what others miss. And because she does it well, the room begins to assume she will continue doing it. Her labor stops looking like labor. It starts looking like atmosphere. Something natural. Something effortlessly generated. Something she must not mind because she rarely complains. That is another relationship that can feed on silence, any system that benefits from my output while ignoring my interior cost. I think this is why the difference between being needed and being cherished matters so much. Being needed can feel powerful. It can make me feel indispensable. But being cherished feels entirely different. Cherishing does not depend on my depletion. It does not require me to stay quiet about what hurts. It does not make me responsible for carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. It does not grow colder when I become more defined. A relationship that cherishes me can survive my honesty. A relationship that feeds on my silence often cannot. That does not mean every strained reaction proves a relationship is toxic. Healthy people can be surprised by change. They can fumble. They can need time. But there is a difference between adjustment and punishment. A healthy relationship may wobble and then reorient. An unhealthy one often retaliates. It may withhold warmth, increase guilt, escalate confusion, recast my boundary as aggression, turn my self-respect into an accusation. That distinction has become one of the clearest ways I evaluate relationships now. What happens when I stop making myself smaller? What happens when I become less available, less instantly forgiving, less willing to explain beyond dignity? What happens when I say no without decorating it? What happens when I refuse to carry what belongs to two people? The answer to those questions tells me more than years of vague hope ever did. Because hope can keep a woman in unequal relationships far longer than truth will. Hope says maybe if I explain it one more way. Maybe if I'm softer. Maybe if I'm patient. Maybe if I don't make this the hill. Maybe if I wait for a better time. Maybe if I keep the peace a little longer, the relationship will finally become what I have been trying to love it into being. But some relationships are not waiting to become healthier. They are waiting to see whether I will resume my old role. That is a devastating realization, especially when there is real history involved. But it is also clarifying. Because once I see that a dynamic has been surviving on my silence, I can no longer pretend my silence is neutral. It is participation. It is maintenance. It is a contribution to the very thing that is draining me. I do not say that to blame myself. I say it because agency begins there. The moment I understand that my silence has been functioning as relational currency, I can begin deciding where I am no longer willing to spend it. That decision is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a changed tone, a shorter answer, a slower reply, a declined invitation, a refusal to revisit the same circular conversation, a limit that stays in place even when the other person does not like it. And yes, some relationships will weaken when that happens. But I have learned to ask a harder and more honest question now. If a relationship cannot survive my truth, what exactly has it been loving? That question has no easy answer. But it has brought me closer to the only kind of love I want to build my life around now, the kind that does not require my silence to feel secure. Boundaries, what they really are and why women misunderstand them. For a long time, I misunderstood boundaries because I had only ever imagined them from the outside. From the outside, a boundary can look sharp, final, slightly intimidating. It can look like a woman who is certain, composed, almost untouched by the emotional weather around her. I thought boundaries belonged to women who did not tremble after difficult conversations. Women who did not second-guess themselves in the car afterward. Women who could say no without hearing guilt scrape across the inside of their ribs. I did not realize that many boundaries are born in women who are still afraid. Not because they are weak. Because they are finally tired enough to stop abandoning themselves. That distinction matters. Because when women misunderstand boundaries, we often delay them until our lives are nearly unbearable. We wait until resentment becomes visible. Until exhaustion begins to stain everything. Until the relationship has deteriorated so badly that the boundary comes out sounding harsher than the truth itself ever needed to sound. Then we tell ourselves we are bad at boundaries, when really we just waited too long to honor what we already knew. I think many women misunderstand boundaries because we were taught to associate them with punishment. If I pull back, I must be trying to hurt someone. If I say no, I must be rejecting them. If I stop answering the phone the way I used to, I must be cold now. If I no longer explain every choice, I must be arrogant or withholding. If I protect my peace, I must have become less loving. But that is not what a boundary is. A boundary is not a punishment. It is not revenge with better manners. It is not an attempt to control other people. It is not a speech designed to impress anyone. A boundary is the point where I stop participating in my own depletion. That is the simplest and truest definition I know. It is the quiet line where I decide that my tenderness cannot keep being extracted without care. That my time is not communal property. That my body is not an open house. That my mind does not need to remain available to every demand, crisis, guilt trip, or emotional reach simply because I am capable of handling it. I had to learn this in real life, not in theory. With Evelyn, boundaries did not begin as some grand confrontation between mother and daughter. They began in the smallest, least cinematic way possible. I stopped staying on the phone after the conversation had already crossed into the same old territory that left me feeling reduced. I stopped trying to prove that I was still a good daughter while she said things that scraped against me in familiar places. I stopped explaining, in 5 different tones, why I did not want to discuss certain people or certain topics or certain old judgments about my life. I began ending the call earlier. At first, that felt almost unbearably rude. Not because it was rude. Because I had been conditioned to believe that access was love. I had to learn that those are not the same thing. With Daniel, boundaries looked different. They had to. There was still Claire. There were still practical things that needed to be communicated. But I began realizing that a boundary with an ex-husband is not always about cutting contact. Sometimes it is about changing the doorway through which contact happens. It is about refusing the emotional sprawl of a conversation that should have remained practical. It is about not letting logistics become a bridge back into old relational habits where I was once expected to absorb, soften, and stabilize more than my share. A boundary there sounded like, let's keep this about Claire's schedule. It sounded like not responding to the emotional undertow hidden beneath a simple question. It sounded like choosing clarity over nostalgia, even when nostalgia tried to disguise itself as cooperation. With Marissa, boundaries were harder in a different way. Friendship has a way of making women feel morally obligated to endure confusion much longer than we should. We are taught to be generous with context, with seasons, with history, with hardship. And there is beauty in that. But there is also danger if compassion becomes the excuse I use to remain available to behavior that keeps draining me. My boundary with Marissa was not a dramatic ending. At least not at first. It was a changed pace. A slower response. Less emotional access. Fewer long calls. A refusal to become the landing place for every emergency she created and then handed to me with the expectation that I would hold it carefully. That is the thing about boundaries. They are often less verbal than women imagine. Sometimes a boundary is spoken. Sometimes it is embodied. Sometimes a boundary is not a speech. It is a behavior. It is me no longer picking up the phone every time. It is me not answering a text right away just because someone else feels urgent. It is me choosing not to discuss my divorce over lunch with someone who has not earned that level of tenderness. It is me leaving before resentment has a chance to become the soundtrack of the evening. It is me deciding that my Sundays in Seattle do not need to be consumed by everyone else's needs simply because I used to allow that. Women misunderstand boundaries because many of us think a boundary means I must justify myself thoroughly enough that the other person agrees it is reasonable. But agreement is not what makes a boundary valid. A boundary can be deeply right for me and still be inconvenient for someone else. It can be healthy and still disappoint people. It can be necessary and still make me feel guilty. It can be clear and still be misunderstood. This is where so many women get trapped. We think the discomfort means the boundary was wrong. Often, the discomfort simply means the boundary is new. Or that it is interrupting an old pattern that benefited someone else. Or that I have not yet built enough internal trust to sit calmly inside my own decision. There is also a quieter misunderstanding I think women carry. We think boundaries are mostly about dramatic relationships. Toxic people. Obvious manipulation. Major betrayals. But boundaries are just as necessary in ordinary life. In decent relationships. In family systems that are not catastrophic but still costly. In workplaces where I am praised and overused at the same time. In dating after divorce, when a man may not be cruel but still assumes emotional access he has not earned. In motherhood, when loving Claire does not erase the fact that I am still a person with a body, a mind, a pace, a need for solitude, a threshold beyond which I become less gentle because I am too depleted to remain myself. Boundaries protect love from turning into obligation. That may be one of the deepest reasons they matter. Without boundaries, love starts to rot at the edges. It becomes duty, performance, silent resentment, invisible scorekeeping, emotional debt. The relationship may continue, but something honest begins to die inside it. A boundary does not kill love. Often it is the only thing that gives love a chance to become honest again. I also think women misunderstand boundaries because we confuse them with emotional hardness. We imagine that to be boundaried I must become less warm, less generous, less open-hearted. But what I have found is the opposite. Boundaries have made my love less frantic, less contaminated by resentment, less tangled with guilt and over-functioning. Boundaries did not make me colder. They made me cleaner. My yes began to mean more because it was no longer automatic. My presence became more sincere because it was chosen, not extracted. My listening became more generous because it was no longer forced by fear. That changes everything. I remember making a short list one evening after Claire had gone to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone lukewarm beside me, and I wrote down a few simple phrases that felt impossible and necessary at the same time. I'm not available tonight. I'm not discussing that. I need more notice. No, I can't do that. I'm heading home now. Let's keep this about Claire. They were such plain sentences. Nothing elegant. Nothing theatrical. But I could feel, writing them down, How much of my life had been shaped by the inability to say ordinary things without emotional overcompensation. I had made simple boundaries feel morally loaded because I was so used to measuring my goodness by my availability. That is another way women misunderstand boundaries. We think they are about being less kind. In reality, they are often about finally being kind in the right direction. Toward myself. Toward my body when it says enough. Toward my mind when it needs quiet. Toward my time when it has been sliced too thin. Toward the part of me that has spent years waiting for me to stop offering her up so easily in order to keep the room comfortable. There is grief in this. Of course there is. Some people do not love boundaries because boundaries reveal where they have mistaken your openness for entitlement. Evelyn could hear distance in places where I was only trying to create health. Daniel could sometimes hear coldness where I was only trying to create structure. Marissa could hear rejection where I was only trying to stop disappearing. That hurt. It still hurts sometimes. But their interpretation could not remain the final authority over what I knew I needed. That, too, is part of what a boundary really is. It is the moment I stop handing my self-definition to the reactions of other people. It is the moment I trust that a clean no may create more real peace in my life than a resentful yes ever could. It is the moment I understand that access to me should not remain unlimited simply because I have historically tolerated too much. And maybe most of all, it is the moment I accept that love without limits is not always love. Sometimes it is just the old pattern asking for one more chance to call itself devotion. How I started respecting myself before anyone else did. What changed my life was not the moment someone finally saw my value clearly. It was the moment I began to see how often I had asked other people to confirm something I was still refusing to practice toward myself. That realization was not empowering in the glamorous sense. It was quiet, a little humiliating, and deeply clarifying. Because I could no longer keep saying I wanted respect while continuing to participate in my own diminishment. I could no longer tell the story as though I was only waiting to be treated better by other people. I had to face the more difficult truth. In small, daily ways, I was still treating myself as if I were negotiable. Not worthless. Not invisible. But negotiable. My time was negotiable. My rest was negotiable. My emotional energy was negotiable. My body's signals were negotiable. My preferences were negotiable. My peace was negotiable whenever someone else's need arrived with enough urgency, disappointment, sadness, or history attached to it. That was the part one had to grieve before I could change anything real. Because self-respect, at least in my life, did not begin as a feeling. It began as a refusal. A refusal to keep handing myself over in pieces while calling it love, maturity, womanhood, or character. A refusal to keep being admired for endurance when endurance was quietly starving me. A refusal to keep waiting for somebody else to handle me carefully while I was still overriding what I knew in order to remain easy for them. I think many women imagine self-respect as confidence, and sometimes it can look like that from a distance. But what it felt like to me, especially in the beginning, was much less glamorous. It felt like inconvenience. It felt like awkwardness. It felt like not explaining as much. It felt like the terrible silence after a sentence I would once have softened. It felt like disappointing Evelyn without immediately rushing back in to repair her mood. It felt like not letting Daniel turn logistics about Claire into pathways back into emotional familiarity. It felt like replying to Marissa later, or not at all, and then sitting with the guilt instead of betraying myself to make it go away. Self-respect did not arrive as power. It arrived as practice. And practice is humbling. I had to start with ordinary things because my life had been built out of ordinary compromises. Not dramatic sacrifices. Small, repeated surrenders. So the rebuilding also had to happen in small, repeated acts. I began watching where I disappeared most quickly, where I volunteered too fast, where I answered before I felt, where I smiled while tightening inside, where I became efficient at serving the moment rather than inhabiting it. Those were the places where self-respect was missing, not as a theory, but as behavior. That distinction mattered to me. Behavior. Because I had spent years understanding myself at the level of insight. I could explain my patterns. I could trace them back to childhood. I could speak intelligently about people-pleasing, family dynamics, emotional labor, all of it. But none of that changed my life until I began acting like someone whose inner life deserved protection in real time. That was harder than understanding. Understanding is private. Behavioral change becomes visible. And the moment something becomes visible, the people around me begin responding to it. That is why I think women delay self-respect for so long. Not because we do not know what is happening. Because we know exactly what it might cost. We know Evelyn may call us distant. We know Daniel may become irritated when calm access to us is no longer guaranteed. We know Marissa may feel rejected the moment we stop being emotionally available on demand. We know family may call us different, colder, less forgiving, less warm, less like ourselves. But I had to ask a more frightening question than whether people would approve of my change. What happens if I never change? That question unsettled me in a way guilt never had. Because I could see the trajectory of the old life too clearly. More overextension. More resentment disguised as maturity. More self-betrayal in tasteful language. More evenings where I looked perfectly functional from the outside and privately felt as though I had spent the day rented out to everyone except myself. I did not want that to become my permanent atmosphere. So I started with mornings. Not because mornings are magical, but because I realized the first hour of my day often revealed my deepest assumptions about who my life belonged to. If I woke up and immediately checked messages from Evelyn, or answered Daniel before I had even heard my own thoughts, or opened the emotional weather report of everyone else before stepping into my own interior, then I had already confirmed the old hierarchy. Their needs first. My center later, if there was any time left. So I stopped. I made coffee before opening my phone. I stood in my kitchen in Seattle while the light came in gray and soft through the window and let myself be unneeded for a little while. I wrote in a notebook. Sometimes nothing profound, just sentences messy enough to belong only to me. Sometimes I walked around Green Lake before work and paid attention to what my body felt like when no one was actively pulling on it. Sometimes I just sat still and let quiet become something other than the absence of demand. Those mornings were not grand. But they changed the emotional structure of my life because they taught me something I had almost forgotten. I am a person before I am a point of access. That sentence did more for me than any affirmation ever could. I also began changing how I lived inside my home. After the divorce, I had been so focused on functionality that I had almost turned the house into a station of recovery rather than a place of belonging. It was where things got handled. Meals, laundry, bills, Claire's schedule, sleep. But self-respect asked for more than efficiency. It asked whether my home reflected care for me, not just maintenance of life. So I started paying attention to details I had once dismissed as frivolous. I bought flowers from Pike Place on weekdays just because I liked seeing something alive on the table. I used the good dishes when I ate alone. I lit candles in the evening not for atmosphere in some performative sense, but because I wanted the room to feel like it welcomed me. I stopped acting as though comfort had to be earned by collapse, as though beauty needed witnesses before it was justified. For some women, these things sound small. For me, they were corrective. They told the neglected parts of me that I was not only allowed to survive here, I was allowed to feel accompanied by my own life. That mattered more than I expected. I started taking myself places too. Quietly. Without turning it into a statement. I had no interest in performing independence. I simply wanted to know if I could remain with myself without feeling the need to fill the space with somebody else's presence, validation, or emotional movement. So I went to the Seattle Art Museum alone and let myself linger in front of one painting longer than anyone else would have wanted to. I drove to the water and sat without music. I took a short trip to Portland for work and stayed an extra evening so I could have dinner by myself and notice what loneliness actually felt like when I stopped fleeing it. Sometimes it was ache. Sometimes it was relief. Sometimes it was both at once. But what surprised me was this: once I stopped treating solitude like a threat, I became much less vulnerable to relationships that depended on my fear of being alone. That is one of the hidden roots of self-respect. It is not only knowing what I deserve. It is becoming less willing to trade myself away just to avoid empty space. I also had to change the way I thought about beauty, which may sound unrelated but was not. Evelyn had a complicated relationship to beauty, and I absorbed more of that than I understood at the time. There was always a subtle message that a woman could look nice, but not too pleased with herself. She could be attractive, but not too self-possessed. She could enjoy expression, but only if it stayed modest enough not to threaten anyone. That kind of conditioning follows a woman into adulthood in strange ways. She begins editing herself before the world even asks. So part of respecting myself meant becoming less apologetic in my own presentation. I wore the red coat I loved without wondering if it made me look too visible. I bought lipstick because I liked the ritual of putting it on before dinner, even if the dinner was only mine. I let beauty become pleasure instead of negotiation. Not for male attention. Not to prove anything after Daniel. Not to compete with anyone, certainly not with Marissa, whose relationship with attention had always felt more volatile than peaceful. I did it because there was something healing about no longer participating in my own dimming. Self-respect, I found, often looks like stopping the small betrayals that no one else notices. Leaving when I say I am going to leave. Not lending emotional energy where I already know it will not be handled carefully. Speaking plainly instead of beautifully when plainness is true. Refusing to explain my fatigue to people who treat rest like laziness. Keeping promises to myself even when nobody would punish me for breaking them. That last one changed me more than I can say. I had become so accustomed to being reliable for everyone else that I had not fully noticed how unreliable I had become with myself. I would promise rest and then override it. Promise distance and then re-enter. Promise honesty and then soften it. Promise I was done and then make one more exception. It was difficult to respect myself while constantly watching myself abandon my own word. So I started smaller than pride would have preferred. If I said I was leaving at 8, I left at 8. If I decided not to answer that night, I did not answer that night. If I told myself I needed a quiet weekend, I stopped filling it up to avoid guilt. If I knew a conversation with Evelyn would only reopen familiar wounds, I shortened it. If Daniel tried to lean emotionally where I had clearly set a practical line, I returned the conversation to Claire. If Marissa reached for the older version of me, I did not immediately resurrect her. These things sound almost mechanical written out like this, but they were not mechanical in my body. They were emotional. Costly. Tender. Every time I honored one of those decisions, some old part of me panicked. Some old part whispered that I was becoming hard, selfish, less loving, less available, less good. I did not become free by silencing that voice immediately. I became freer by not obeying it every time it spoke. That is what self-respect became for me, not the absence of guilt, but the willingness to act with integrity before guilt had fully loosened its grip. And eventually, something changed. Not overnight. Not cleanly. But steadily. I trusted myself more. I no longer felt the same frantic urge to be understood by everyone. I became less interested in presenting myself as generous if the price was inner dishonesty. My no grew quieter but stronger. My yes became more meaningful because it was no longer automatic. I began to feel that strange and beautiful experience of alignment, where what I felt, what I knew, and what I did were no longer at war with one another all day long. No one can give that to me. People can respond to it. They can respect it. They can resent it. They can misunderstand it. But they cannot manufacture it on my behalf. I had to begin it. Before Evelyn. Before Daniel. Before Marissa. Before anyone else could learn the new shape of me, I had to stop abandoning it myself. That was the beginning of self-respect. Not a performance. A reunion. Anger, grief, and the emotions women were told to hide. What I did not understand for a long time was that anger was never the enemy. The real danger was what happened when I kept turning away from it. Women are taught to fear anger before we are taught to understand it. We are warned about becoming bitter, difficult, dramatic, hard to love, hard to live with. We are taught to admire the woman who remains gracious, composed, forgiving, elegant under pressure. The woman who can take a wound and still pass the bread politely. The woman who knows how to smooth the atmosphere before anyone has to sit too long with what actually happened. I learned that language early. Not necessarily in direct lessons, but in tone, in example, in what was praised and what was quietly discouraged. My mother, Evelyn, had a way of treating anger as something unbecoming in a woman unless it came out sideways, disguised as disappointment, criticism, or silence. Clean anger, direct anger, anger that belonged fully to its owner and spoke plainly about what was not acceptable, that kind of anger had no real place in the emotional world I came from. So I learned to translate. I translated anger into patience, into understanding, into one more chance, into overthinking, into a quieter voice, into the exhausted sentence, "It's fine," when it was not fine at all. That translation cost me more than I knew. Because when anger is denied long enough, it does not disappear. It changes form. It settles in the body. It becomes chronic tension. It becomes emotional flatness. It becomes resentment that leaks into the wrong places. It becomes the sudden sharpness in my voice with Claire after a long day, not because she caused it, but because I had been swallowing myself elsewhere. It becomes the private fantasy of disappearing for a week so no one can reach me. It becomes fatigue so deep I call it burnout when some of it is actually unspoken rage. I think many women are not disconnected from anger because they do not have it. They are disconnected because they do not trust themselves to survive what anger might reveal. Anger reveals truth too quickly. It tells me when something has violated me. It tells me when I have given beyond willingness. It tells me when a relationship is asking me to disappear in order to remain intact. It tells me when my politeness has become permission. That is why anger is so inconvenient. It threatens arrangements that depend on my silence. I felt this most sharply with Daniel, though it took me years to name it honestly. While I was still married, my anger rarely came out looking like anger. It looked like overfunctioning. It looked like trying harder. It looked like taking on more emotional responsibility so I would not have to fully face how lonely I felt in a relationship that still looked stable on paper. It looked like becoming more reasonable each time my deeper needs were not met, as though logic could substitute for intimacy. I told myself I was being mature. What I was often being was afraid. Afraid that if I let myself feel the full shape of my anger, I would no longer be able to keep telling the old story about what the marriage was. After the divorce, the anger shifted. It became clearer. Not simpler, but cleaner. I was angry not only at what had happened between us, but at how often I had abandoned myself while trying to preserve something that required too much translation. I was angry at how skillfully I had mistaken endurance for love. Angry at the years I spent staying emotionally elegant while parts of me were starving in plain sight. That anger was not glamorous. It did not make me feel strong. It made me grieve. And that is what I think many women are never told. Underneath anger, there is often grief waiting with its hands open. Grief for the years I spent carrying what should have been shared. Grief for the younger version of me who believed more effort would eventually be reciprocated. Grief for all the times I asked so little because I had already learned not to expect enough. Grief for the woman I might have become sooner if I had trusted my own pain earlier. Anger and grief are close relatives. One protects, the other mourns. And when women begin to set boundaries later in life, both often rise together. I saw this with Marissa too. My anger with her did not begin as a clean break. It came in waves of recognition. Moments when I would leave a conversation feeling drained and strangely ashamed, as though I had once again handed over too much of myself in the name of loyalty. Moments when I noticed that her need always seemed to arrive with urgency, while my interior life remained something she visited only when it suited the rhythm of her own emotions. Moments when I realized the friendship had room for my listening, my steadiness, my care, but not always for my full complexity, my limits, my changing shape. What made that painful was not only the imbalance. It was the fact that I had called it closeness for so long. There is a specific kind of heartbreak in realizing a relationship was sustained partly by your inability to tell the full truth about how it felt. That heartbreak has anger in it. It also has grief. Grief for misreading something because I needed to believe it was more mutual than it was. Grief for how long I called depletion devotion. Grief for the old self who felt valuable mostly when she was indispensable. And then there is the grief that sits inside mother wounds, the grief that does not become easier simply because I am older now. My feelings about Evelyn have never fit neatly into one box. That is part of what makes mother-daughter pain so difficult to speak about with honesty. There can be love, loyalty, tenderness, duty, memory, and still a wound that never fully closes because the person who formed me also taught me, in countless subtle ways, that parts of me were safest when they were edited. My anger with her was never only about a harsh comment or a manipulative tone or a conversation that left me feeling reduced. It was about atmosphere. About growing up in the presence of a woman whose own unresolved pain often made my aliveness feel like something to manage rather than something to nurture. To feel that anger cleanly as an adult is devastating, because it presses against a deeper sorrow. I cannot go back and give the younger me a different mother. That is grief in its purest form. Not revenge. Not blame. Not even always outrage. Just the unbearable honesty of what was not there. What tenderness was missing. What permission was absent. What reflection I did not receive. What ease I never learned. And yet, even here, I have had to learn that compassion is not the same thing as self-betrayal. I can understand Evelyn's limitations and still name the impact. I can see that she was formed by her own history and still refuse to let that history keep shaping my nervous system unchecked. I can love her and still feel angry. I can feel angry and still not become cruel. That last part matters, because women are often given a false choice. Either I stay soft and silent, or I become sharp and unrecognizable. Either I forgive before I have felt anything fully, or I become consumed by bitterness. But there is another way. There is a form of emotional honesty that does not require me to become vicious in order to become clear. It begins with allowing anger to be information. Not a character flaw. Not a moral failure. Not something I must immediately spiritualize, soften, or transcend. Information. Anger tells me where I have been crossed. It tells me what my body has been trying to say while my mouth stayed polite. It tells me what no longer fits. It tells me what I cannot keep calling love if I want to remain whole. And grief tells me what mattered. It tells me what I hoped for. It tells me where my heart kept investing even when reality gave me reasons to pull back. It tells me what I lost, what I never got, what I still wish had been true. Grief is not weakness. It is the measure of attachment. That is why so many women feel both relieved and devastated after setting a boundary. The relief comes from finally honoring reality. The devastation comes from accepting what reality means. It means some relationships will never become what I wanted them to become. It means some people loved the role I played more than the whole of who I am. It means some chapters only looked sustainable because I was absorbing the hidden cost. I think mature women feel this grief in a particular way. Not because younger women do not suffer, but because with age comes a sharper awareness of time. I know what it cost to stay that long. I know how many holidays, years, chances, apologies, restarts, and rationalizations went into the making of a painful pattern. I know what I gave. I know what I postponed in myself. I know what I waited for. When change finally comes, it is not just about the present. It is about everything the present has gathered inside it. That is why emotional work later in life can feel so heavy. Not because I am doing it wrong, because I understand the stakes more fully now. I know what I am grieving. The old image of myself. The fantasy of certain relationships. The hope that someone would eventually become more careful because I had been so patient. The belief that if I loved well enough, spoke gently enough, stayed long enough, I would be met in the places that mattered most. Sometimes the hardest grief is not losing the person. It is losing the story I told myself about what the relationship could still become. And still, there is something deeply dignified about a woman who allows herself to feel all of this without abandoning herself again. Who lets anger speak without letting it run wild. Who lets grief come without trying to make it tidy too quickly. Who understands that tears after a boundary are not proof the boundary was wrong. Who understands that guilt can be an echo, not a compass. Who understands that sadness does not mean she should go back. That woman may not look triumphant. She may look quiet. She may look tired. She may look like someone sitting in her car near the water after a difficult call, letting herself feel what she has spent years outrunning. But something holy is happening there. She is no longer hiding from the emotions that were trying to save her. She is listening. And that, more than any polished version of healing, is what begins to make her whole again. What changes when I stop asking to be chosen? Something shifts in a woman's life when she stops arranging herself around being chosen. It is not always visible at first. It does not arrive with applause. It can even feel like loss before it feels like freedom. But beneath that first layer of discomfort, something profound begins to reorganize itself. I think many women spend years, sometimes decades, moving through life with an unspoken question underneath almost everything. Am I being chosen here? Chosen as worthy. Chosen as lovable. Chosen as desirable. Chosen as good enough. Chosen as the one people stay for, call first, return to, trust, prefer, keep close. That question can hide in places that do not look romantic at all. It can hide in a marriage, where I am still trying to become easier to love even after the vows are long behind us. It can hide in friendship, where I overextend because I want to remain central in someone's life. It can hide in work, where I become excellent beyond reason because being valued feels safer than being simply human. It can hide in family, where I keep offering emotional access because some old part of me still hopes to finally be received in the way I always needed. Being chosen is not just about desire. Often, for women, it is about confirmation. Confirmation that I matter here. That I belong here. That I am not too much, too complicated, too tired, too changed, too honest, too boundaried, too aware now to fit comfortably into the old role. So when I stop asking to be chosen, I am not merely changing a mindset. I am interrupting a whole emotional economy that has shaped my decisions for years. That interruption is rarely glamorous. At first, it can feel like emptiness. The phone is quieter. The room changes. Some people do not reach as often. Some invitations fade. Some conversations do not come back once I stop carrying them. Some dynamics that once felt alive begin to reveal how much of that life came from my overparticipation. That can hurt. A woman can mistake this quieter season for rejection if she has spent much of her life equating attention with belonging. But not every silence is abandonment. Sometimes silence is what remains when performance ends. Sometimes it is the sound of false intimacy draining out of a life that had been too crowded with emotional obligation. When I stopped asking to be chosen, the first thing that changed was not the outside world. It was my perception of it. I started seeing more clearly who had been responding to my truth and who had been responding to my usefulness. That distinction altered everything. With Daniel, I could see more clearly how often I had once confused cooperation with emotional allegiance. There had been a time when part of me still wanted him to validate the version of me that had carried so much quietly in the marriage. To see it fully. To understand it belatedly. To honor it in a way that might somehow redeem what had been missing. But the moment I stopped needing that from him, I became freer. Not because all pain disappeared, but because I was no longer placing my healing in the hands of the person who had once participated in my depletion. That is one of the quiet freedoms of no longer asking to be chosen. I stop waiting for the people who wounded me to become the ones who restore me. I stop handing them that power. With Marissa, the shift was different but just as revealing. Once I stopped trying to preserve my place in her life through constant emotional availability, I began seeing the friendship without all the soft lighting I had once placed around it. I saw how often I had mistaken access for intimacy. How often I had made myself indispensable because being needed felt safer than risking the possibility that, without all that giving, the relationship might thin out. And when it did thin out, I had to face a sorrow I had delayed for years. Some people are more attached to what I provide than to who I am when I stop providing it. That realization can feel brutal. But it is also clarifying. Because when I stop asking to be chosen, I stop confusing maintenance with love. I stop assuming that every bond deserves endless extension simply because it has history. I stop believing that my job is to remain emotionally useful enough that people never have to confront the loss of easy access to me. That changes friendship. It changes dating. It changes the way I move through rooms. It changes the way I hear silence. I think this is especially true for women in midlife. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from realizing how much of my adult identity may have been shaped by subtle performances of worthiness. Being the thoughtful one. The understanding one. The attractive one, but not threatening. The capable one, but still warm. The independent one, but never so independent that no one feels needed by me. The good mother. The good daughter. The emotionally evolved woman who can keep everything graceful no matter how heavy it becomes. When I stop asking to be chosen, some of those performances begin to fall away. Not because I become careless. Because I become less willing to organize myself around being legible to everyone else. That can feel deeply unfamiliar. I may go to dinner alone and realize how much of my life I once experienced through the lens of how I was being perceived. I may walk into a room and notice the old reflex to charm, soften, accommodate, or earn ease before I have even checked whether I want to be there. I may feel the urge to explain a boundary not because it needs explanation, but because some older part of me still wants to be approved of while I set it. But over time, something steadier begins to take shape. I become less susceptible to flattery, less impressed by attention that has not earned depth, less tempted by relationships that awaken longing but not peace, less interested in being wanted by people who do not know how to hold my complexity. This is where discernment deepens. Because when I no longer need every meaningful relationship to reassure me of my worth, I start making cleaner decisions. I can ask different questions. Not do they like me, but do I feel safe in my own body around them? Not will they choose me, but what version of me comes alive in their presence? Not can I make this work, but why am I still trying to work so hard in a place that keeps asking me to negotiate against myself? That shift changes the texture of daily life. My mornings become less frantic because I am not waking up already in pursuit of emotional confirmation. My home becomes quieter in a different way, not lonely but less crowded with invisible debt. My calendar changes because I am no longer filling it with people and obligations that make me feel temporarily included while permanently tired. Even my body changes. My breathing slows. My face softens. My pace becomes less urgent. I stop moving like someone who is trying to keep her position in everyone else's life secure. That is no small transformation. A woman who is no longer asking to be chosen becomes much harder to manipulate. Guilt loses some of its grip because I am less dependent on other people's approval to interpret myself. Ambiguity loses some of its glamour because I no longer confuse emotional uncertainty with chemistry. Scarcity loses some of its power because I have stopped treating every inconsistent relationship like a final chance at connection. This does not make life emptier. It makes it more honest. And honesty can feel sparse at first if I am used to noise. There may be fewer people, fewer dramatic conversations, fewer frantic check-ins, fewer moments of feeling central in someone else's crisis. But what I gain is harder to quantify and far more valuable. I gain interior room. Room to think without interruption. Room to notice what I actually enjoy. Room to hear my own preference before someone else's expectation rushes in. Room to Mother Claire from a steadier place, not from the edge of depletion. Room to build a life that does not depend on external pursuit in order to feel meaningful. That matters. Because when a woman stops asking to be chosen, pleasure returns in subtler forms. Not the pleasure of being desired or validated, but the deeper pleasure of inhabiting her own life without constant emotional performance. A walk feels like a walk again. Music lands somewhere. A meal tastes like more than fuel. The evening light in the kitchen matters. A quiet Saturday is not a referendum on my worth. It is simply a day that belongs to me. This also changes how I understand love. Love is no longer the thing I audition for through patience, usefulness, beauty, flexibility, or restraint. Love becomes something I evaluate by a different standard. Can it survive my honesty? Can it remain warm when I am not overextending? Can it hold my boundary without turning punishing or cold? Can it meet me without requiring my diminishment? Those questions become possible only when I stop organizing myself around the ache of being selected. And yes, something is lost in this process. The old fantasy, perhaps. The fantasy that if I become just right, certain people will finally love me well. The fantasy that being needed guarantees being cherished. The fantasy that attention is proof of depth. The fantasy that I can earn steadiness from people who only ever learned how to receive me in pieces. Losing those fantasies hurts. But it also creates the conditions for something truer. Not perfection. Not invulnerability. Not a life where no one disappoints me. But a life where I disappoint myself less. A life where I am no longer standing at the edge of every relationship asking, will you choose me, while quietly leaving myself behind in the process. That is what changes. I stop waiting at the door of other people's approval with my whole life in my hands. I walk back inside myself. And from there, everything becomes clearer. The woman in the middle, not broken, just returning to herself. There is a kind of woman the world rarely notices in any meaningful way because she is still functioning too well to be considered in trouble. She gets up. She goes to work. She answers messages. She remembers appointments. She buys groceries. She pays bills. She shows up for her child, her family, her responsibilities. She is not collapsing in public. She is not making dramatic declarations. She is not posting cryptic messages at midnight, asking to be seen. From the outside, she looks fine. Maybe even admirable. Maybe especially admirable. She is the woman who still knows how to carry herself. The woman who can move through a room without spilling too much. The woman who has learned how to keep life going, even when something inside her has gone quiet. I know that woman because I have been her. Not once. Not briefly. But in layers. In seasons. In ways so subtle that I did not even realize I was disappearing while it was happening. I thought I was maturing. I thought I was being realistic. I thought I was learning how to survive adulthood with grace. And some of that was true. But another part was harder to admit. I had become so practiced at carrying life that I stopped asking whether the life I was carrying still felt like it belonged to me. That is the woman in the middle. Not broken. Not destroyed. Not beyond repair. Just far enough from herself that the distance has started to ache. I think this middle place is one of the loneliest places a woman can live in, because it is not dramatic enough for other people to recognize it as suffering. If I were shattered, maybe someone would stop me. If I were visibly falling apart, maybe I would stop myself. But the middle is harder. The middle is where I am still capable enough to keep performing wellness while privately feeling estranged from the woman inside the performance. This is where many women live for years. The woman in the middle may be divorced, like me, and still sorting through the emotional afterlife of all she carried with Daniel. She may still be mothering, like I am with Claire, and trying to love well without disappearing in the labor of care. She may still be navigating a mother like Evelyn, where history and guilt and tenderness and damage all live in the same room. She may still be disentangling herself from friendships like the one I had with Marissa, where closeness and depletion became so intertwined that it took real grief to separate them. The woman in the middle is not always asking for a new life. Sometimes she is asking for a way back into the one she already has. That is what makes this season so sacred and so painful at the same time. Because returning to myself has not looked like reinvention. It has not looked like becoming someone louder, harder, colder, or more impressive. It has looked much quieter than that. Much less glamorous. It has looked like noticing where I still leave myself behind and choosing, slowly, not to do it again. Returning to myself has looked like the paused reply. The unreturned call. The conversation I shorten before it turns into another small erasure. The subject I refuse to reopen just because someone else wants access to old versions of me. The evening I protect. The no I do not decorate. The rest I take before my body is desperate enough to force it. The beauty I allow back into my life without apologizing for it. The anger I listen to instead of translating into politeness. The grief I stop trying to rush through. The truth I stop diluting just to remain easy to love. These are not dramatic acts. That is exactly why they matter. Because a woman does not usually disappear from herself in one catastrophic moment. She disappears in increments. In repeated compromises. In the 1,000 tiny places where she learns to smooth over what she feels in order to preserve what others expect. So it makes sense that she returns in increments too. In small acts of loyalty to herself that begin to add up. In decisions so modest they almost look invisible from the outside, but inside, they rearrange the entire emotional structure of her life. That is what the middle has taught me. The middle is not failure. It is not punishment. It is not proof that I have wasted my life or loved the wrong people or stayed too long or understood too late. It is the place where illusion begins to wear off. The place where I can no longer keep calling depletion love. The place where performance starts to crack. The place where what once looked manageable starts to feel expensive. The place where I begin to understand that surviving is not the same thing as inhabiting my own life. This is why I feel protective of women in the middle. Women between 35 and 60, especially. Women old enough to have history, young enough to still feel the ache of possibility, tired enough to know they cannot keep living on emotional autopilot. Women who have spent years being wives, ex-wives, mothers, daughters, workers, caretakers, peacemakers, listeners, organizers, stabilizers. Women who are not looking for empty encouragement. Women who do not need somebody yelling at them to become their best selves. Women who need something quieter and truer than that. Language. Recognition. Permission to stop calling the numbness normal. Because the middle can make a woman doubt herself. If I am not in crisis, do I really have the right to want more truth? If no one is openly abusing me, do I really have the right to be tired? If I can still function, do I really have the right to say something is off? Yes. Not because my pain has to compete with anyone else's. Because my life is still mine. That may be the deepest lesson in all of this. My life is still mine. Even after Daniel. Even inside the unfinished complexity of Evelyn. Even after Marissa. Even while raising Claire. Even after all the years I spent being who I needed to be in order to survive certain rooms. My life is still mine to re-enter. And re-entering it does not require permission from the people who preferred me more accessible, more accommodating, more blurred around the edges. It does not require a unanimous vote from family. It does not require the old relationships to suddenly become healthier so that my healing can feel justified. It begins in me. In the quiet decision to stop measuring my worth by how well I disappear. I think some women are afraid that if they stop disappearing, they will become selfish. But what I have found is different. When I stop disappearing, I do not become selfish. I become more honest. More specific. More present. Less resentful. Less split inside myself. Better able to love from truth rather than obligation. Better able to recognize what is mine to carry and what never was. Returning to myself has not made me perfect. I still feel guilt sometimes. I still hear old voices. I still know the reflex of over-explaining. I still have moments when I want to slide back into being easy because being clear can feel costly. But I know too much now to confuse that cost with wrongness. I know what it feels like to live too far from myself. I know what it does to a woman to keep giving other people access to versions of her that no longer feel true. I know the quiet sadness of being admired for strength when what I really wanted was to be met with tenderness. And because I know that, I also know this: the way back is not through becoming someone else. It is through becoming less false. Less edited. Less available for distortion. Less willing to perform peace where there is no peace. Less willing to keep every door open just because someone once had a key. More willing to belong to myself first. That is what the woman in the middle is really learning. Not how to become extraordinary. How to become internally aligned. How to live in such a way that her outer life no longer demands the betrayal of her inner one. How to sit in her own home and feel like a person, not only a role. How to move through her relationships without constantly negotiating against her own nervous system. How to let certain things end without treating the ending as proof that she failed. How to accept that some forms of loneliness are cleaner than false closeness. How to stop waiting for life to begin once everyone else is comfortable. And maybe that is what I want to leave here most clearly. If you are in the middle, it does not mean you are behind. If you are tired, it does not mean you are weak. If your life looks fine and still feels emotionally thin, it does not mean you are ungrateful. If you are questioning dynamics you once tolerated, it does not mean you are becoming difficult. It may mean you are becoming honest enough to feel your own life again. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of return. And return has its own dignity. Not loud dignity. Not performative dignity. The kind that lives in a woman's face when she no longer explains beyond what is true. The kind that lives in her voice when she stops asking permission to have limits. The kind that lives in her home when peace is no longer constantly interrupted by people who only loved her when she was easy. The kind that lives in her body when she stops fighting herself in order to keep everyone else comfortable. So if you are listening to this and something in you feels raw, or tired, or quietly seen, I want to say this as plainly as I can. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before you go, I want to ask you a small question. Which one feels more true for you right now? A. I am still trying to keep the peace, even when it costs me. B. I am starting to choose myself, even when it feels uncomfortable. Comment A or B below. And if you want, tell me why. I would really love to hear your perspective, your story, or what part of this spoke to you most, so other women reading the comments can feel less alone too. If this kind of conversation matters to you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. Your support helps me keep making the next honest piece.